Him. And I'm glad to be back to be making videos again. This month, every month, I'm going to deal with a different book. We're going to get into it, we're going to read from it. And this month, I'm going back to an old favorite, The Making of America, because we need to deal with how we got here. And the only way to do that is to know what this country was made of, how it was made, and how it was put together. And this is a very good book Time Life put out. Very thin, very easy. And the thing with these is you can jump around. So I'm going to jump around. Um, and I don't know if we'll get through the whole book this month, but we'll get through most of it. The Peculiar Institution. In rejecting British rule, the colonists declared that all men ought to be free, well, almost all men. How slavery became America's original sin. A modern day George Washington, former General and Secretary of State Colin Powell, once reflected that the Declaration of Independence, I think, is one of the most remarkable documents in the world, but went on to lament that it didn't apply to black folks. The man who wrote the Declaration, with its ringing reveal that all men are created equal, was one Thomas Jefferson, slaveholder. Monticello's master well understood the inconsistency of his actions, once writing to a friend, "If there is a just God, we are going to pay for this." Americans did pay and continue to pay for this system that bound master and slave, white and black, in its iron embrace. In 1619, a Dutch sea captain bound for the Caribbean put at Jamestown, Virginia, uh, put in at Jamestown, Virginia, where he traded some of his valuable cargo of human beings in shackles for food and other supplies. Although the transatlantic slave trade had been thriving for nearly a century, almost all its traffic was between Africa and the Spanish colonies of Central and South America. But the Virginia colonists soon realized the value of unpaid labor, and by the next year they were placing orders for more slaves with Dutch, English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese shippers. Plantation owners in neighboring colonies, especially Maryland and the Carolinas, quickly followed suit. The influx of low-cost workers made it possible for their vast farms to prosper by exporting shiploads of labor-intensive crops to Europe, first rice, then sugar, coffee, cotton, and tobacco. For the first decade or so of slavery's existence in America, the colonists improvised the legal aspects of the system that came to be called, in a triumph of obfuscation, obfuscation, the peculiar institution. Most early slaves were considered indentured servants, and a handful were allowed to work their way to freedom. Within 20 years of 1619 landing, however, the word slave began appearing in colonial records and statutes. By 1640, Maryland had formally charged the legal status of African slaves to that of property. The following year, Massachusetts did the same, describing as legal chattel such strangers as willing sell themselves or are sold to us. While more than 70% of all slaves brought to America lived and worked in the South, slavery was practiced in every colony. 11 black slaves were brought to New York, then New Netherlands, by the Dutch West India Company only 6 years after the first group landed at Jamestown. They helped build the defensive barrier from which Wall Street takes its name. New York would be home to the largest number of slaves among the northern colonies for another 175 years. While northern cities like Boston and New York had less use for unskilled agricultural labor than did Jamestown and Charleston, they grew fat on the trade. Their wharves thick with the mass of ships that brought slaves in and crops out. So lucrative was the market for humans in bondage that slaves came to be known as black gold, centuries before the term was applied to describe oil. The explosive growth fueled by this boom stoked the demand for more and more unpaid laborers. By the late 1760s, there were between 250,000 and 500,000 slaves in Britain's American colonies, and slave ships were bringing Africans in chains to the world at a rate of more than 50,000 new arrivals each year. As visions of independence began to entice colonial minds, the moral implications of slavery emerged, belatedly as an inescapable, intractable issue. Passion Passionate advocates of the rights of man denounced the trade. Benjamin Franklin called it an atrocious debasement of human nature. One eloquent voice against the practice was that of Jefferson, who eventually owned more than 200 slaves. In an early draft of the Declaration of Independence, he ignored colonial complicity in slavery while condemning King George for having waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life, liberty, and the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur misery, death in their transportation thither. That passage was struck from the final version of the Declaration, at the insistence of Southern delegates, but the peculiar institution could not be written off so easily. America would pay a grievous price for its original sin. The bill came due in 1861. And here's a nice picture. This is an old book, so the pictures in here really hold up. These books really hold up. It's on nice quality paper. So we're still suffering, and in months to come, I'll be reading books about different things like redlining and all of that kind of stuff. So we'll go back and forth. We'll deal with politics. We'll deal with society. We'll deal with psychology. And but this is this month's book, May 2020, and we need to know where we came from, so we know where we're going. It's an old cliche, but it is true. Until next time, I thank you for your patronage. Please be safe, take care of your mind, and take care of your body.